Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 1 and 10 together. Our overarching objective for COP26 is to keep within reach the goal of limiting average global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. To achieve this, we've been asking countries to set out ambitious emissions reduction commitments, come forward with adaptation plans, for developed countries to deliver on their climate finance promises, and for us collectively to reach agreement on the outstanding elements of the Paris Rulebook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the government's recent wise decision to recognise that environment-saving gene editing technology should be recognised differently to GM, will ministers use COP26 to champion this and other cutting-edge science and technologies that provide some of the best solutions to the problems of sustainability and climate change?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raised a really important point, and of course science and innovation are absolutely crucial to tackling climate change and also delivering green growth. Innovation will be discussed at the World Leaders Summit at COP26, and on the 9th of November we will provide a particular focus on discussing and indeed showcasing science and innovation's role in tackling climate change.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Along with the national and global policy objectives of COP26, many local voluntary organisations are already raising awareness of the impact of climate change. One such in my constituency is Climate Action Wendover. Does my right honourable friend agree that the work they do is important in helping people to understand that the only way to reach net zero is by everyone changing the way they behave at home, at work and in their local community?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate my honourable friend and indeed Climate Action Wendover for all their work in encouraging climate action from local residents and businesses. And of course, local communities across the country are playing their part in tackling climate change. And I want to tell my honourable friend that the Cities, Regions and Built Environment Day at COP26 will indeed provide a focus on local community action.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will know that there is widespread concern about a lack of clarity as we get so close to COP as to what will actually be happening at the summit and what the priorities will be. Could he tell me what discussions he's had with the small island developing states to make sure that their concerns are fully represented, that they have a voice at COP and that we actually come away from COP with something that really helps them meet the challenges that they face?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady raises an incredibly important point, and yes, I have a very regular dialogue with representatives of small island developing states, and I've been very clear. I think one of the things we want to do through this presidency is champion the developing countries who are at the front line of climate change.
SNP spokesperson Deirdre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to hear that the COP President is interested in challenging those developing countries, given that climate change's most severe impacts fall heaviest on those developing countries that had least to do with causing it, and that many consequences of climate change are already locked in, regardless of mitigation of efforts. Its vital COP26 includes an agreement on loss and damage compensation. Is the President's government aiming for an equitable loss and damage agreement that compensates developing nations and recognises the disproportionate role of developed nations in causing that loss and damage?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can tell her that loss and damage is an issue that ministers have debated at both the London ministerial meeting that I hosted, but also in the pre-COP in Milan. And clearly what comes forward at COP will be a consensus agreement, but I can tell her that we are determined to make sure that the Santiago network is operationalised, and of course we will see what further discussions take place around this issue.
Given that more than a quarter of the increase in carbon emissions since 2000 have come from China, are we expecting a strong and prominent Chinese delegation at COP26?
Mr. Speaker, there will be a delegation coming from China. As he may know, that I was there in September. I had constructive discussions, but China, along with every other country, needs to come forward with ambitious plans to cut emissions by 2030 before COP26.
And we go to Anna McMorran.
Question number 2, Mr. Speaker.
President Sean.
Mr. Speaker, the commitments by countries at Paris in 2015 bent the curve of global warming to below 2 degrees, and the International Energy Agency, in a report published last week, has concluded that if countries deliver on all their recent commitments, we are on course for around 2 degrees. But in order to keep 1.5 within reach, all countries, particularly the G20 nations, need to submit ambitious 2030 emission reduction targets and, of course, commit to net zero by the middle of the century.
The Mac-Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister talks of ambitious plans, but the government's net zero roadmap yesterday is weak on land and agriculture. 20% of the UK's annual emissions come from natural resources. No plan can claim to build back greener unless we're doing everything in our power to achieve the 2-degree target or, in fact, the 1.5-degree goal. But peatlands are the biggest storage of carbon, and they continue to be burnt. The government's ban only includes a third of upland peatland, allowing the rest to burn. So what is the government doing to shut down the loophole that it created?
Very good.
President Sharma.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the first thing I'd say that in terms of net zero strategy, it is a coherent and comprehensive plan. It's been welcomed by many people. It's been welcomed by business. It is about emissions coming down and jobs being created. But when it comes to peat, she will know that we have published already a peat strategy, and I'd be very happy to share that with her.
Paul Howell.
Mr. Speaker. Would you agree with me and the APBG for Left Behind Neighbourhoods that sometimes the way to get people engaged is actually by engaging them with things that matter to them, like the cost of heating in their house, as opposed to changing the green agenda every time? If we can go for different agendas for people, it can get a lot more acceptance and a lot more buy-in.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is indeed a champion for his Sedgefield constituency, and he's right. He's pointed out a number of ways that we can bring about change in terms of obviously reducing the cost of bills, but also ensuring that we are helping to cut emissions. There is a role for all of us to play.
Mr. Speaker, with 10 days to go before COP, much is riding on the shoulders of the COP President, and we wish him well. But to deliver 1.5 degrees, we have to cut emissions by 28 billion tonnes by 2030, a halving of global emissions. So far, the pledges made for Glasgow amount to at most 4 billion tonnes, so we're not yet where we want to be. Does he agree with me that we need to be honest about this maths? And if he does, can he tell us his assessment of how much of this gap we can close at Glasgow to keep 1.5 alive?
President Sharma.
Well, Mr. Speaker, both the Right Honourable Gentleman and I agree that we have to ensure that we close the gap and that we halve emissions by 2030 on a 2010 baseline. Now, it is the case, as I said in answer to an earlier question, is that because of the commitments that have been made, as long as they're followed through on, we are heading towards 2 degrees. But clearly, what we need is the G20 to come forward with their emissions reduction targets, and then we will have to have a consensus view on how we reach agreement for the next few years.
Can I suggest to him that the rest of the UK government could make a difference, even in these final days, by not undermining his work? So the Trade Secretary should not be giving big emitters a free pass by doing a deal with Australia, allowing them to drop their temperature commitments. The Prime Minister should deliver on the promise made at the G7 to vaccinate the developing world by the end of 2022. And the Treasury should stop undermining the green transition at home and help build the international coalition we need by reversing the cut in overseas aid in the budget. Does he agree with me that these suggestions would help him deliver on his historic responsibility at the COP?
President Sharma.
Mr. Speaker, the whole government is committed to our net zero strategy, which was published yesterday. It is about creating 440,000 jobs by 2030. It is about another £90 billion of inward investment. And we saw some of that coming through yesterday at the Global Investment Summit. What I would say to him is that the whole of the government is committed to ensuring that we have success at COP26. And just the very fact that the Secretary of State is still on this bench shows her commitment to COP and to her work on adaptation.